I am investigating one of the most persistent and unsettling mysteries to emerge from the final days of World War II, the story of a heavily armored train believed to be carrying vast quantities of Nazi gold and stolen valuables. A train that did not crash, did not surrender, and did not leave behind wreckage, but instead vanished completely, as if it were swallowed by the ground itself. According to long-standing accounts, this train was last seen traveling toward what is now southwestern Poland, moving in the direction of the region near the town of Wałbrzych, and for nearly 8 decades its disappearance remained the subject of rumor and speculation, until events in 2015 suddenly pushed the story back into global attention. That year, 2 treasure hunters announced they believed they had located the missing train buried beneath dense forest land. And their claim was taken seriously enough that Polish authorities publicly stated they were almost completely certain the discovery was real, prompting armed guards to secure the site while excavation equipment was brought in and international media began closely monitoring the operation. As digging progressed and crews worked deeper into the ground, expectations centered on the possibility of uncovering gold, artwork, and other stolen wartime valuables. But when the excavation finally reached a sealed underground structure, the operation came to an abrupt halt under circumstances that were never fully explained to the public. Officials did not announce the discovery of treasure, nor did they confirm the absence of it, but instead imposed silence, releasing no photographs, granting no interviews, and restricting access to the site, while workers connected to the project quietly disappeared from public view, transforming what had begun as a high-profile treasure hunt into a controlled and opaque investigation. The sudden shutdown raised an obvious question that remains unanswered. What could possibly be hidden inside a buried train that would cause authorities to stop everything without explanation? To understand how such a mystery could exist at all, it is necessary to return to January of 1945, when Nazi Germany was collapsing under the relentless advance of the Soviet Red Army, which was pushing westward at a pace that left little time for orderly retreat or documentation. During this period, German cities were evacuated in panic. Officials destroyed records, burned documents, and attempted to erase evidence of crimes and theft committed throughout the war, creating an atmosphere of chaos in which extraordinary actions could be taken without oversight. It was in this environment that residents near the city, then known as Breslau, now Wrocław, reported seeing an unusual train, one that stood apart from ordinary military transports due to its heavy armor and the presence of armed guards who prevented anyone from approaching. Stories passed down through generations describe large numbers of crates being loaded onto the train under strict security, each marked with official insignia, with some witnesses later claiming they briefly saw gold through damaged containers, while others recalled wrapped paintings, jewelry, and valuables that clearly did not belong to routine military supplies. The train's reported destination was the Owl Mountains, a remote and heavily forested region that was largely avoided by civilians, and after the train entered that area, it was never seen again, leaving behind no confirmed arrival records, no unloading documentation, and no surviving witnesses who could explain what happened next. For many years, historians dismissed the story as another wartime legend born out of fear and confusion, and under normal circumstances, such skepticism would have been justified. But the credibility of the story changed when attention turned to the location where the train was said to have vanished. The Owl Mountains were not simply empty wilderness during the war. They were the site of one of the Third Reich's most secretive and least understood construction efforts, a massive underground project known as Project Riese. Between 1943 and 1945, thousands of forced laborers from concentration camps were worked under brutal conditions to carve kilometers of tunnels and vast chambers into solid rock, creating an underground complex whose intended purpose was never fully disclosed. Many of these laborers died during construction, and what makes the project even more disturbing is that large portions of the tunnel network were never completed, with some sections sealed abruptly, others intentionally flooded, and several collapsing under circumstances that remain unexplained. To this day, significant parts of the underground system remain unexplored because they are considered too dangerous to enter. And the existence of such a secretive and unfinished complex in the same region where an armored train vanished makes the story increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. As decades passed, reports from local residents continued to surface, describing unexplained underground noises, abandoned rail tracks that appeared to run directly into mountainsides before stopping abruptly, and family stories about trains that entered tunnels during the final weeks of the war and never emerged. One such account came from a retired railway worker who claimed his father had been ordered to guard a train during loading operations in early 1945, and later watched it disappear into a tunnel entrance, after which it was never seen again. In 1975, the mystery deepened further when an elderly German man, reportedly nearing death, confessed to having been involved in the operation to hide the train, providing details about the soldiers involved, the timing of the operation, and the use of explosives to seal the tunnel permanently. Before he could lead anyone to the location he described, the man died, leaving behind a confession that could not be verified but added yet another layer to a legend that refused to fade. Over time, the story of the missing train became embedded in local culture, with children daring each other to explore abandoned tunnels and periodic waves of treasure hunters arriving with equipment, usually leaving empty-handed and reinforcing the belief that the story was nothing more than folklore. For decades, the lack of physical evidence seemed to support that conclusion, until history itself demonstrated that the systematic hiding of enormous quantities of stolen Nazi wealth was not only possible, but had already occurred on a massive scale elsewhere in Europe. The assumption that the missing train was nothing more than folklore became far harder to defend once history confirmed that Nazi officials had in fact hidden enormous quantities of stolen wealth in locations specifically chosen to keep them out of Allied hands as long as possible. In April of 1945, as Allied forces advanced deeper into Germany, 2 French civilians approached American soldiers with information about a salt mine near the town of Merkers, explaining that it was no longer being used solely for mining and that something of significant value had been stored deep underground. By that stage of the war, American troops had already heard countless rumors about hidden gold and underground bunkers filled with treasure, most of which turned out to be exaggerated or entirely false. And there was every reason to treat this tip with skepticism. Yet something about the certainty of the information convinced commanders to investigate further. When Allied forces descended into the tunnels of the Merkers salt mine, what they found exceeded even their most extreme expectations, revealing stacks of gold bars arranged with military precision, thousands of bags filled with gold coins, crates of foreign currency looted from occupied nations, and priceless artwork stolen from museums across Europe. The sheer scale of the discovery was staggering, with the gold alone valued at billions of dollars in today's currency. But what made the sight profoundly disturbing was what lay scattered among the official treasure, including rings taken from fingers, watches stripped from wrists, and gold fillings extracted from the mouths of concentration camp victims and melted down as part of a systematic plunder operation. This was not random theft carried out in desperation. It was organized, documented, and executed with industrial efficiency, revealing the extent to which the Nazi regime had turned mass robbery into an administrative process. Within days, General Dwight Eisenhower himself visited the mine, ensuring that the discovery was thoroughly documented, photographed, catalogued, and made known to the world, leaving no doubt that these hidden treasure stories were grounded in reality rather than myth. The Merkers discovery fundamentally changed how historians viewed wartime legends, proving that massive quantities of stolen wealth had been deliberately concealed as defeat loomed, and raising an unsettling question about how much more remained hidden beyond the reach of Allied recovery efforts. Estimates suggest that the total value of wealth stolen by the Nazi regime would equal hundreds of billions of dollars today, and despite decades of investigation and recovery, less than a fifth of it has ever been located, leaving an enormous gap between what was taken and what has been found. Some of that missing wealth was deliberately destroyed or abandoned as Allied forces closed in, while other portions were disposed of in ways designed to make recovery nearly impossible, including being dumped into lakes, rivers, and seas across Europe. One of the most notorious examples is Lake Toplitz in Austria, a remote alpine lake that became infamous after divers discovered crates of counterfeit British banknotes at its bottom during the late 1950s. These banknotes were part of Operation Bernhard, a secret Nazi plan to destabilize the British economy by flooding it with nearly perfect forgeries that were so convincing even trained banking officials struggled to distinguish them from genuine currency. As the war turned against Germany and the operation became a liability, the counterfeit notes were loaded onto boats and deliberately sunk in the lake rather than allowed to fall into Allied hands. What makes Lake Toplitz particularly sinister is not just what was dumped there, but the lake's unusual physical properties, as it plunges hundreds of feet deep and becomes completely devoid of oxygen below a certain point. In those oxygen-free depths, objects do not decay in the normal way, meaning anything that sinks past that threshold can remain preserved for centuries, frozen in near-perfect condition and effectively unreachable. Over the years, the lake has claimed multiple lives, with divers becoming trapped in submerged debris or overwhelmed by toxic gases that rise from the depths, leading governments to impose strict limits on exploration and fueling persistent rumors that additional valuables remain hidden far below the surface. Other disappearances followed a similar pattern, including what became known as Rommel's gold, though the story actually centers on Walter Rauff, a German officer stationed in North Africa who oversaw the confiscation of gold, jewels, and valuables from Jewish families and businesses as Allied forces advanced. According to historical estimates, several tons of treasure were loaded for transport to Europe, yet the shipment vanished without any confirmed arrival records, leaving behind nothing but speculation about whether it was sunk at sea, secretly unloaded, or hidden before it could be intercepted. Perhaps the most famous and heartbreaking disappearance of all involves the Amber Room, an extraordinary chamber constructed entirely from amber panels, gold leaf, and mirrors, often described as the eighth wonder of the world. Originally created in the 18th century, the room was looted by Nazi forces during the invasion of the Soviet Union, dismantled piece by piece, packed into crates, and transported to Königsberg, where it was displayed for several years. As Soviet forces closed in, the Amber Room was hurriedly removed once again, and from that moment on, it vanished completely, with no confirmed sightings, no recovery, and no definitive explanation. Some believe it was destroyed during bombing raids. Others argue it was sunk during an evacuation by sea, while alternative theories suggest it may still lie hidden in a mine, bunker, or underground chamber somewhere in Europe. Repeated expeditions have attempted to locate it, including a highly publicized search in Poland in 2017 that uncovered a hidden chamber large enough to hold the Amber Room, only for investigators to find it completely empty. Taken together, these discoveries and disappearances establish a clear historical pattern, showing that the systematic concealment of stolen wealth was real, widespread, and executed with long-term secrecy in mind. It is within this context that the claim made in 2015 by Piotr Koper and Andreas Richter must be understood, not as an isolated rumor, but as a potential continuation of a proven strategy used repeatedly during the final months of the war. Koper, a construction worker with practical experience in structural analysis, and Richter, a German researcher who had spent years studying wartime rail logistics, had not arrived at their conclusion by accident or guesswork. For more than 2 years, they methodically scanned the Owl Mountains region using increasingly sophisticated equipment, eventually producing ground-penetrating radar images that appeared to show a long metallic object buried beneath the surface. The scans suggested a structure roughly 100 meters in length, buried at a depth consistent with deliberate concealment rather than natural collapse, and the linear, symmetrical shape was difficult to reconcile with ordinary geological formations. Their findings aligned with historical accounts of railway lines that once existed in the area but vanished from post-war maps, reinforcing their belief that they had located something intentionally erased from official records. Rather than attempting a private excavation, they followed legal procedures, formally notifying authorities and requesting the finder's fee provided under Polish law, a step that immediately elevated their claim beyond casual treasure hunting. The response from officials was remarkable, with Poland's deputy culture minister publicly stating that he was more than 99% certain the train had been found, a declaration that instantly propelled the story onto the world stage. The declaration by senior Polish officials that they were nearly certain the train had been found triggered an immediate and explosive reaction across global media, transforming the quiet town of Wałbrzych almost overnight into the focal point of international attention and speculation. Journalists arrived from every major news organization. Satellite trucks lined the roads near the alleged site. Camera crews established semi-permanent camps, and hotels that normally struggled to fill rooms suddenly found themselves booked months in advance as the story dominated headlines around the world. The economic impact alone was extraordinary, with analysts later estimating that the publicity generated by the claim brought the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars in global exposure to the region, even before a single shovel officially broke ground. This was no longer simply a rumor being chased by hobbyists, because the Polish government treated the discovery seriously enough to involve the military, citing safety concerns related to unexploded wartime ordnance and the structural instability of the terrain where the train was believed to be buried. Armed guards were posted around the site in rotating shifts. Security fencing was erected to restrict access, and officials emphasized that any excavation would require careful planning due to the risk posed by explosives, collapsed tunnels, and decades-old infrastructure hidden beneath the forest floor. In November of 2015, 2 independent teams were authorized to conduct formal, non-invasive surveys of the area, one led by Koper and Richter, and the other by specialists from the AGH University of Science and Technology in Krakow, an institution with extensive experience in geological analysis and mining surveys. The university team had access to more advanced scanning equipment and a deep historical understanding of the region's underground formations, and their involvement was intended to provide an authoritative assessment of whether anything artificial lay beneath the surface. By December, the Krakow team delivered its conclusion, stating that their scans showed no evidence of a buried train at the claimed location and that the radar anomalies identified earlier could be explained by natural geological features, including Ice Age rock formations that sometimes produce misleading readings on less sophisticated equipment. The announcement appeared to deal a decisive blow to the story, and many observers concluded that the mystery had finally been resolved, dismissing the gold train once again as a wartime legend, fueled by misinterpretation and wishful thinking. Koper and Richter, however, refused to accept that conclusion, insisting that their data had been misread, that the anomalies were too linear and symmetrical to be natural, and that they knew precisely what they had detected beneath the ground. Against considerable skepticism, they succeeded in raising private funding for a full-scale excavation, determined to prove that their interpretation was correct and that the official assessment had been mistaken. In August of 2016, they assembled a team of 64 specialists, including professional engineers, geologists, chemists, archaeologists with experience at wartime sites, and even a military demolitions expert, reflecting the seriousness with which they approached the operation. The excavation cost more than $100,000 and unfolded under constant media scrutiny, with cameras documenting each stage as heavy machinery cut into soil that had not been disturbed since the final days of the war. For 7 days, the world watched as expectations built, toward a moment that many believed would confirm decades of speculation, waiting for the unmistakable sound of metal or the outline of a buried structure to emerge from the earth. That moment never came. Despite careful digging and extensive analysis, the team uncovered no train, no tracks, no tunnel entrance, and no evidence of a concealed structure at the site. And after a week of excavation, the operation was officially declared a failure. To the public, the conclusion appeared final, reinforcing the narrative that the gold train was nothing more than a compelling myth that collapsed once subjected to direct examination, and interest in the story rapidly faded as attention moved elsewhere. What was not known at the time was that while cameras focused on the failed dig near Weubschick, another investigation was unfolding quietly in a completely different location, far from the spotlight and without any public announcements. Near the town of Luban, close to the Czech border, a private research group had been conducting its own systematic search using a combination of advanced satellite-based soil analysis and ground-penetrating radar technology far more sophisticated than what had been available to earlier teams. Unlike the highly publicized efforts near Weubschick, this group avoided media attention entirely, focusing instead on inconsistencies they had identified in historical railway documentation from the war years. Their research revealed a curious anomaly, a railway siding that appeared consistently on wartime logistics maps but was completely absent from all post-1945 records, not rerouted, not dismantled, but simply erased as if it had never existed. Satellite imagery of the area showed subtle ground disturbances consistent with a filled-in railway bed, suggesting deliberate concealment rather than natural decay or post-war redevelopment. The researchers concentrated their efforts on a collapsed embankment that previous searches had largely ignored due to the unstable terrain, and when careful excavation finally began, what emerged was unmistakably artificial. Beneath layers of debris and sediment lay a rectangular armored structure reinforced with riveted steel, in a manner consistent with wartime transport designed to protect valuable cargo, buried at a depth and orientation that indicated intentional placement rather than accidental collapse. Soil analysis confirmed that the layers covering the structure had not been disturbed since approximately 1945. Reinforcing the conclusion that whatever lay beneath had been concealed deliberately and left untouched for decades. The structure showed no signs of forced entry, no breach, and no damage consistent with post-war interference, suggesting that it remained exactly as it had been sealed during the final months of the war. When investigators carefully opened the armored section, they found what generations of stories had promised: crates bearing Reichsbank markings, official insignia confirming government origin, wrapped canvases believed to be stolen artwork, jewelry and precious stones consistent with looted valuables, and foreign currency from multiple occupied nations. The discovery alone represented millions of dollars in recovered wealth, with the potential value of the artwork far exceeding that figure if confirmed to match items long listed as missing from wartime records. For the researchers involved, it was the discovery of a lifetime, apparent proof that the gold train legend had been grounded in reality all along. But as the team progressed toward the rear of the final car, they encountered something that would change the entire meaning of the discovery and transform the operation into something far more serious than a treasure recovery. As the researchers moved deeper into the armored structure and approached the rear of the final car, they encountered a feature that immediately stood apart from everything they had already uncovered. A thick internal wall reinforced far beyond what would be necessary for ordinary cargo storage. What made this wall instantly suspicious was not only its thickness, but the way it had been constructed, because analysis showed it had been welded shut from the inside of the car, leaving no door, no handle, no access mechanism of any kind. A design choice that suggested permanent concealment rather than secure transport. This was not a compartment intended to be opened later, and it was not designed for retrieval under any circumstances, but instead appeared to have been sealed deliberately to ensure that whatever lay behind it would remain hidden indefinitely. The level of effort involved in creating that sealed chamber indicated that its contents were considered more sensitive, more dangerous, or more consequential than the gold, artwork, and valuables stored throughout the rest of the train. It took nearly 48 hours of careful cutting and structural reinforcement before the team could safely create an opening large enough to peer inside without compromising the integrity of the car. When lights were finally directed into the chamber, the reaction was immediate and unmistakable, with experienced professionals falling silent as they tried to comprehend what they were seeing. What lay inside was not additional treasure, not more gold, and not artifacts of wealth, but dozens of wooden crates stacked with meticulous precision, each numbered, labeled, and catalogued with a level of order that was deeply unsettling. As the crates were opened, it became clear that they contained personal belongings rather than valuables, including civilian clothing, children's shoes in a range of sizes, old suitcases bearing faded identification tags, sealed envelopes covered in handwritten German script, and bound files filled with names, numbers, and shorthand notes. There were crates filled with eyeglasses, hundreds of pairs carefully sorted and organized, crates containing bundles of human hair labeled and preserved, and collections of personal effects that had clearly been stripped from individuals and recorded with bureaucratic efficiency. The implications of what was discovered became apparent to everyone present at the same moment, because this was not a random accumulation of lost property, nor was it evidence of displaced civilians fleeing the chaos of war. The systematic organization, the documentation, and the deliberate concealment all pointed toward belongings taken from people who had disappeared without official transport records, individuals who had been removed from existence in a way designed to leave no trace behind. Those involved in the excavation later described the atmosphere inside the car as suffocating, not because of what was visible at first glance, but because of what the organization itself represented. A methodical process of erasing lives and then hiding the evidence where it would never be found. The moment that sealed chamber was opened, the nature of the entire operation changed, and what had begun as a historical investigation and treasure recovery instantly became something far more serious. Access to the site was restricted almost immediately, workers were dismissed with minimal explanation, and researchers were instructed to surrender everything they had collected, including notes, photographs, soil samples, and radar data. Security around the area increased dramatically, with guards assigned in rotating shifts and the perimeter reinforced to prevent unauthorized access, while the temporary structures covering the excavation were dismantled and removed. Soon after, unmarked vehicles began arriving at the site during nighttime hours, leaving before dawn, with no public explanation of what was being transported or where it was going. Officially, responsibility for the operation was transferred to the Polish Ministry of Culture and National Heritage, and carefully worded statements referenced an ongoing investigation without providing substantive details. In practice, it became increasingly unclear who was directing the operation. As requests for information went unanswered, scheduled briefings were canceled, and previously available contact numbers stopped working altogether. When journalists attempted to return to the area, they were turned away, and aerial footage later showed the excavation site enclosed by fencing and covered with heavy tarps, ensuring that whatever was happening next would take place entirely out of public view. What followed was perhaps the most striking development of all, as major media outlets that had once devoted extensive coverage to the gold train story suddenly fell silent. A handful of brief reports acknowledged that a train had been located, but there were no follow-up investigations, no detailed analyses, and no sustained coverage, even from organizations known for aggressive reporting. The absence of information itself became a signal, reinforcing the sense that the gold had never been the true focus of concern, but rather a distraction from something far more consequential. Because what lay behind that welded wall was not simply evidence of theft, but documentation of a system designed to make people disappear completely, and to ensure that no record of their existence would ever resurface.